Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. The Biden administration is putting firmer pressure on governments using child soldiers. For the first time in 10 years, the U.S. will not be issuing any full waivers to partner nations found to be in violation of the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, which restricts government military funding to countries that use or recruit child soldiers. In 2020, the United Nations reported more than 8,000 children were actively being used in combative conflicts around the globe, although most were not forced into military service by state actors. To learn more about child soldiers, we're joined now by Keely Hutton, author of Soldier Boy, an eye-opening story about a child soldier abducted to fight in Uganda's decades-long civil war. Keely Hutton, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. It's a privilege to be here and speaking with you today.
So much to cover. Although the definition of children and therefore child soldiers tends to vary between countries, this decision by the Biden administration has confirmed that 7 of the 12 countries that have currently been flagged for using child soldiers in their defense forces in 2022 will certainly not receive military funding from the U.S. until this issue is resolved. How significant is this body of legislation?
Something definitely has to be done. We have a history in our world of children, so you're talking about anyone under the age of 18 being pulled into conflicts, whether they're doing so voluntarily or in the case of, Soldier Boy, Richard Anwar's story, and many of the children during the Ugandan Civil War being forced into service as child soldiers. And so I think the first step is that it does need to be recognized, and it needs to be called out, and they need to be held accountable in some fashion to try to stop this constant use of children in fighting in conflicts.
And should children stand trial for war crimes?
That's difficult. I feel that I may have had a different opinion prior to working with Ricky on Soldier Boy to that question. Having worked with Ricky in discussing, he's helped over 25,000 former child soldiers and war-affected youth in northern Uganda through his organization, Friends of Orphans. And the goal of Friends of Orphans is to help in the recovery, the rehabilitation, and the reintegration of former child soldiers and war-affected youth and orphans into the communities in northern Uganda. And through speaking with Ricky, these children, they're not, most of them even at an age where the decisions they're making are not their own. They're being forced through fear, through indoctrination, through threats, through abuse. And for them, they are in a mode of survival. Mm-hmm. And it comes down to, in villages, where Ricky lived, that, children were being forced to not just kill, but kill their own relatives, kill family members. And then fearful, and part of that was to sever the connection of those children to their community, so that if they did escape, there was nowhere to escape to. They were fearful that they were going to be, like you said, held accountable, be tried, possibly imprisoned, or worse, for crimes that they were forced to commit by adults when they were children.
Like Ricky, most children who grow up in areas of conflict are certainly at risk of becoming child soldiers. The book is historical fiction. Can we talk a little bit about where the truth ends and where fiction actually picks up?
Right. So in the early conversations that Ricky and I had together about, his vision for his story, what he hoped that his story would convey, he was very concerned that the graphic nature of those 2.5 years of captivity would overshadow what he hoped to be his message would be hope and strength and community and perseverance. And so we talked about, well, how can we present that? Because if we had told the story just chronologically from the time that he was, captured, there was no moments for the reader to breathe. There were no down moments for him where, things were good. Mm-hmm. So I proposed that I was like, well, what if we do two storylines, set 20 years apart, one starting was at 86 and one in 2006, and look at what he's doing in northern Uganda with his organization.
Mhm.
So in order to do that, we decided to create, it's a fictional, so Samuel's storyline set in 2006, he's a fictional character. He's an 11-year-old boy who has just been brought to Friends of Orphans, he had been a child soldier for 3 years. He's a composite character of all of the stories Ricky told me about the children that he's helped, that they have helped at Friends of Orphans. And I felt strongly, we could have, I guess, chosen a child there to be representative, but Ricky is a grown man who willingly came forward and said, I want to tell my story. I did not feel comfortable, using a nonfiction story of a particular child to do that. So the Samuel story is fiction based on stories he's told me about the children he's helped. Ricky's story is his story. We stayed true to his story.
Yeah, very nice. What happens when a child soldier escapes war?
Well, it probably depends on the region that they're in, but based on what Ricky told me, especially when he escaped. So when he finally escaped after 2.5 years of captivity, so he was 16, nearing 17 when he finally escaped.
Mhm.
You know, usually they try to go back to their home. They try to find, their village where they left. Unfortunately, at the time of Ricky's escape, there's nothing structurally there to support all of these children who
Mhm.
had been captured and who had been traumatized in the LRA. So, you know, for a long time, he just basically tried to just survive,
Mhm.
living day to day. There was nothing in place to help with the trauma. There was nothing to help economically for
Mhm.
him. So he did odd jobs in the village,
Mhm.
and finally escaped, south where the war really hadn't touched those areas like in Jinja, and was able to work and get an education thanks to the kindness of a woman he worked for there. And then that's one of the reasons he returned to northern Uganda years later after he had received his education, he had gone to university, because he knew that there was such an absence of any assistance for these children that had escaped the war. And unfortunately, there was very few paths for them to take. A lot of times they were ostracized by their communities. They faced abuse in their communities when they did try to come back. Suicide rates were very high
Mhm.
among former child soldiers,
Mhm.
as was, alcoholism.
Hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the fictionalized 11-year-old?
Yeah.
What was it like being a child soldier? Can you bring the viewers into the story, into the experience?
So when Ricky and we worked together for 5 years, and he came to the United States 2 different times to visit, and we were able to talk about the story. We were able to spend hours and days talking about his experience,
Mhm.
and like as I said, shared with me the experience of some of the children with whom he had spoken to at Friends of Orphans over the years, and shared their experiences, and there were definitely some similarities throughout all of their stories, but then each story was uniquely their own as well. But for most of the children, they once they were captured, they were immediately traumatized and abused. And that was to start to break them down, so that they could then be manipulated. So I know Ricky, within the first 2 days of his capture, he and the children who had been abducted in his village and the surrounding villages were forced to witness and then participate in the beating and the death of a young boy who had escaped from the LRA and had been captured. And so immediately that brainwashing, that manipulation, starts to take place. They were taken north up into southern Sudan at the time
Mhm.
to be trained. So they were crossed the border, taken to southern Sudan. But their training consisted of a lot of marching. They were, had to carry sticks instead of weapons. There
Mhm.
was some training where they were trained to, be able to load and unload a weapon quickly. But for the first several weeks to months of the battles that they were forced on, they were forced to fight in these battles unarmed. So they basically became human shields at the front lines. So, and if they survived that, then they were finally given a weapon, to try to protect themselves when they were put in there. Not a lot of food, not, obviously not much care. The abuse was consistent, day to day. Worse for the girls, because the girls were not only forced to fight as the boys were, but they were then forced to, the commanders called them their wives. And so they were raped. They were forced to do the carrying of the supplies, the cooking, the cleaning. So their lives, like Ricky said, were far worse than what the boys were facing.
What happens to child soldiers when war ends? How did Ricky ultimately escape?
So Ricky escaped on 3 different occasions. Twice he was taken back into the LRA. The first time he was taken back, they just assumed that he just got left behind, so there was no punishment for it. The second time he was punished, almost, he was beaten almost within an inch of his life. The second time, and then after that, he decided, he had to get out, and he finally did escape on his third attempt. So then it was just trying to find anyone to try to support him at that point. They traveled at night. He escaped with 2 young boys who he got out with him. They would walk during the night. They'd hide during the day. Fearful that if the LRA found them, that they would be beaten and most likely killed in the fashion that they had seen, early on in their abductions to other escapees. And then, if they did find it to a community, they had to hope that that community would help them and not punish them, because a lot of the communities were very fearful, and understandably so, because these children were being used in raids on the villages, and family members of the people in these communities had been, abused and killed and possibly raped by some of these soldiers. So there was a fear in the communities to even lend assistance to them. So, for Ricky, he was fortunate to find, at least one gentleman, a neighbor in his village, who remembered him and remembered his family, and tried to help and gave him some money so that he could get further south, away from the reach of the LRA.
How did you lean into this experience?
So I have not been to Uganda. I have not visited Uganda. So the bulk of even the descriptions and everything, while working with Ricky, he would describe things to me. I would write them in my notes. I would then try to describe them, through the narrative. I would send, he would get drafts, every draft of every chapter, and he would review them, and he'd be like, yes, this sounds right. No, this is not correct. But I will tell you, the first thing that I did before even really interviewing Ricky, because I was ignorant of the conflict, aside from what little things I'd heard on the news. And so I had to do my homework. And while he was jotting down, making like a timeline for me of the events and what happened in his life, I was having to do research. I was having to educate myself about the conflict. And the very first book that I found, because I knew I had to obviously learn the facts about the war, but I also wanted to learn about the culture so that I could try to accurately depict that for Ricky and his family. And so I found this book, King of the Snakes, and other. So I started looking up poetry, folk tales, and because a lot of our culture can be found within stories. And in the book, there's actually, I think I can't remember if I ended up using 2 of the poems, or I used one of the stories, The King of the Snakes, that's in a scene, and the book opens with a Ugandan lullaby. And so I wanted to get a feel for what the communities felt like in northern Uganda, what they meant to one another, how the family structures were, and then when it came down to, as I said, like trying to describe the setting itself, it was watching a lot of documentaries, talking to Ricky at length, because he lost everything. He does not have a photo of his family. There's nothing that he could have given me to say, oh, this is what this looked like, and what is left of the family compound was pretty much in ruins, because the huts had been burned down. So there's some video and pictures of him standing outside of those, but you don't get the idea of what they looked like prior to the attack on the village.
It's incredible. I mean, it's really well done. It's a really well written project. So I applaud you for your creativity and sort of the work that you put into bringing us this insight. I think while I was preparing for our conversation, I actually did some research and found out that child soldiers are not necessarily unique to developing country economies. The continent of Africa, we see this problem really across parts of Asia, South America, where you did quite a bit of research. I also gathered on child soldiers in Europe, especially during World War I, World War II. What did your research reveal? You shared some really powerful images, but I wonder if you could talk to the viewers a little bit about what your research revealed about child soldiers in other spaces.
Absolutely. So the second after I finished Soldier Boy and worked on that, then my editor Macmillan was, looking for, okay, what's the next project going to be? And I ended up becoming very interested in World War One.
Hmm.
And it actually stemmed from my husband and I were watching an episode of Peaky Blinders. I don't know if you're familiar with
Yeah,
this
you
show.
mentioned it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in Peaky Blinders, the main character, Thomas Shelby, he kept having these like PTSD flashbacks. And every time he did to his service in World War One, and every time he did, he was like underground, and I didn't understand that. So I started doing some, I Googled it, tunnels World War One, and discovered there was this whole secret war fought beneath no man's land in those conflicts, and then just stumbled across the fact that for Britain alone, over 250,000 boys lied about their age to fight in World War One, which was a staggering number. I'd never heard that before. So I wrote the book Secret Soldiers that follows the journey of 5 boys who fought in World War One, 4 of whom end up in the tunnels of World War One. And
Yeah.
what was surprising to me, like juxtaposing that with working on Soldier Boy, where these children had no choice to fight
Mm.
or not. They were abducted from their families. They were forced to fight. In World War One, these children were willingly, going up to recruitment tables, lying about their ages to fight, which I was like, why would any child want to do that?
Yeah.
And some of them, as young as 12 years old, and being allowed to, they were being allowed to fight. And what I discovered, and the reason I ended up writing Secret Soldiers from 5 different perspectives then, was that there wasn't just one reason that was driving these boys to want to fight in the war as child soldiers. Some of them it was, patriotism, some were seeking glory. The war was supposed to initially be over in a few weeks, maybe a couple months. They didn't think it was going to last that long. So a lot of these boys were like, oh, I'm going to go prove I'm a man. I'll go quickly do my thing, and then I can say that I fought in a war. Unfortunately, like in a lot of countries, economic conscription is a driving force. If poverty, if children are living in poverty,
Mm.
the military gives them the option. Hey, we'll feed you. We'll give you some money.
Right.
We'll give you
Yeah.
somewhere to sleep, which some of these children did not have. And
Yeah.
then, unfortunately, you also have children who their circumstances are so horrific at home
Mm.
and abusive at home that going to the front lines of a war seems like the better option.
Take walk, right.
Right. So, there was a myriad of reasons driving these children to want to go and join the fight. Excuse me. And there's also, there's kind of, especially and even today with children, there's a glorification of war
Mm.
in media, in entertainment. And so they're making an uninformed decision on what they're actually getting themselves into. They don't realize the harsh realities of what they're going to face.
You write as a theme, really, a couple, your books are really heavy. You're writing about personal traumas, social ills. How do you disassociate yourself from the pain? Do you get nightmares? Like, how do you deal with sort of the burden of
Right.
these stories?
It's funny. I had a family friend ask once, when I told her what Soldier Boy was about, she was like, well, how, like you said, how do you distance yourself from that? I was like, you can't. You have to fully immerse yourself in your imagination into that world in order to do it justice. And I did. When I was working on Soldier Boy, I have 2 sons of my own, and at the time I started, they were 8 and 11. which
Mm.
put them right around the age, in particularly 11 years old of Samuel in Soldier Boy. And then as I was working on the stories those years, those 5 years, they were growing and into the ages of Ricky and his brother Patrick, who were abducted. And I did have when you first learn about the trauma, the horrific circumstances that these children are put into,
Mm.
it's hard not for that to seep into even your unconscious thoughts.
Yeah.
So for the first few months where I was working with Ricky, I did have recurring nightmare of people coming and taking my children and abducting my children. And but again, I had to try to understand the circumstances Ricky and his family face in order to put that into the narrative to share with readers. And, I no longer have those nightmares, but I
Yeah.
can tell you from speaking with Ricky, he still does to this day. And he's, compared to a lot of people who have gone through similar trauma, Ricky's very well adjusted. He has worked hard. He continues to work hard to help in the recovery of other child soldiers. And for him to say at this many years on that he still has recurring nightmares of the trauma speaks volumes to what these children face.
Back on Ricky for a moment, how does Ricky Anywar define or create his happy ending? What is life now like for him now?
So I think his happy ending is for him that he felt in helping heal others, I'm healing myself.
Mm.
In reaching out to help these children who, like me, have faced the unthinkable.
Mm.
I am helping in my own recovery as well. And one of the things that drew me to Ricky's story is the fact that, Joseph Cohn was at one time in the 90s the most wanted man in the world, right?
Yeah.
He was wanted by governments all over the world for the crimes and the atrocities he was committing. And armies were sent in. I can't remember how many millions were spent trying to find him. He's still to this day, out there. He has not been captured.
Yeah.
But Ricky returned to northern Uganda not with a weapon. He returned with his story. And it was the fact that his story was that powerful that in telling his story to other children who had faced similar trauma, that they were able to start their journey into healing.
Yeah.
It gave them a person that understood what they had been through. They felt that they could trust him. They felt safe with him. They knew that he understood and he was not going to judge them. And that is the first step. And, they've helped over 25,000 former child soldiers and war affected youth in northern Uganda since its inception in 1999. So I think his happy story is the legacy he is leaving behind with helping and healing children like himself.
Incredible. When people read your work, read Soldier Boy, and want to help refugees, children of war that are arriving in this country or parts of Europe, what would you recommend? What do you want them to take away?
Well, I hope that they continue to, if they read the story and they're, I don't want to say interested, but they're interested in learning more about it or interested in learning how they can help, that they will further research and educate themselves on the situations, whether, it's looking at what happened in Uganda, whether it's looking what's happening in Ukraine right now. You do need to educate yourself first. We were talking about before, you definitely need to form an opinion, but make sure it's an informed opinion and make sure you're going to reliable resources. The other thing I think that we need to, as a society, be very careful of is that we aren't keeping these stories out of the hands of our children and our young readers. These stories need to be shared. I have in the past received some pushback from parents saying that, oh, no, this story makes me uncomfortable. I don't find comfort in reading this story. And my response has always been, good, you shouldn't. If you have not experienced what these children experienced, there should be a very high level of discomfort in reading and knowing that this took place.
Yeah.
The flip side to that is anyone who has faced that type of drama will hopefully find comfort in a story like Ricky's story or Achut Deng's story, Don't Look Back, they will realize that they're not alone. And then that will give them a sense of confidence moving forward, that they too can find life beyond the trauma that they have faced. For those who haven't faced that type of trauma, I hope they will look into ways that they can help, that they can spread the information about what is happening. They can look to resources like Friends of Orphans to, if they're looking to donate and try to help with the education, whether it's, school education, vocational education that's being provided, and try to give back so that these children know that they're not just not alone in their communities and their country, but they're not alone in the world.
Right.
There's a chapter in Soldier Boy where Samuel is witnessing, what Friends of Orphans is doing, trying to reintegrate these children into their communities. And all he is seeing is the trauma.
Yeah.
He's seeing the pregnant young girl. He's seeing, the scars on the face of some of these other children who escaped. And in talking to the man in the story who's kind of guiding him through this entrance into Friends of Orphans, he says, he was like, we bring them into these communities because we need the communities to see. And Samuel says, see what? Like, all he's thinking is the crimes that they committed, what has happened to them. And the man looks at Samuel and he says that they are our children. And I think globally, we have to embrace that as well. That, okay, they may not be from our community, but the children of this world are our children. They are going to be our future.
Yeah.
And people hurt. If we don't help these children work through their trauma, they're going to become adults with trauma.
Yeah.
And that cycle of violence and abuse is going to continue.
What's interesting as well, the Sudanese military and a powerful paramilitary group, pressures have mounted and new tensions and new conflict, hostilities have emerged. Many hope that would have ended the civil war, but the last 6 months we've seen more fighting. What is your hope for the new country?
In speaking with Achut, often about the continued violence that is being seen, in her home country of South Sudan, her fear is that, again, it's the children, it's the women who are going to be victimized the most, and that you're going to you have these different factions with a history of aggression towards one another, and they're just passing it on from generation to generation, and it's, one side's hitting, the other side's hitting back, and there's just no end, and then you're creating more generations of people fighting one another. And my hope is that, in talking even to Ricky about the Ugandan situation, like he used an old saying that, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. And, when you have these factions that are fighting one another, it's the communities, it's the country that is suffering. And at some point, you have to get these factions to sit down and have a discussion where they can talk about, okay, what is the future going to look like for their country as a whole? Because it is their country. It's not one side or the other. And hopefully they will all want a future that is going to be bright and promising for the children that are to follow.
Keely Hutton is the author of Soldier Boy. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and sharing this incredible story.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a delight to speak with you again, and I hope the interview, gets people looking more into, the trials of these children throughout the world, because, as you said, it's not just on the continent of Africa; it is throughout the world that children are being used to put forth, agendas that they don't even understand and are suffering because of it.
And that's it for our show today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.